Michael, you are an independent economist, former head of financial markets with the Reserve Bank, former advisor to NZ Treasury, and now economic commentator and blogger through Croaking Cassandra. That must keep you fairly busy, am I right?
Oh, not too busy, but yeah, I mean, it keeps you occupied, keeps my brain ticking over. I left the Reserve Bank about 7 years ago to be a stay-at-home parent, and the commentary stuff is mostly about keeping my brain going. So
that's awesome. Well, what I've seen with the articles that you've put out on Croaking Cassandra is that you don't seem to have any problems keeping that brain going, because it's very insightful. And from where I sit, I just kind of think increasingly it's really, really important for everyday investors to increase our level of understanding a little bit, because if we're kind of operating in a vacuum of situational awareness around our environment, we're increasing the odds that our investment decisions aren't really being fueled by accurate information. It's just second or third or fourth hand information. So that's kind of why I really wanted to catch up with you, because I've heard a little bit about you and want to just climb into that brain of yours and ask you some questions right off the gate here, just to start off with monetary policy, and specifically how it works in tandem with fiscal policy, because we vote for one set of politicians who are democratically elected, yet we seem to get this other set of people thrown in for free. And the separation between the central bank and the government seems to be as blurrier than ever. What's your comments on that to start with, in terms of the separation piece?
I mean, I think the separation made sense. We put it in place about 30 years ago. And the view then was that politicians were going to be a bit prior to running monetary policy too easy, running into an election to stimulate the economy, and then would slam on the brakes after an election. And shifting away from that model, as we did and most other central banks have done, makes sense. There are criticisms around at the moment that suggest that the governor and the bank are under the thumb of the minister. I don't think there's any actual basis for that. I think the Reserve Bank, like their peers overseas, have made some big mistakes in the last couple of years, but they're mistakes that mostly they've made in their own right. It is true that the government sets the target for the Reserve Bank, but the target essentially hasn't changed for the last 10 years. It's much the same now as it was under the previous national government.
And we're currently sitting in an environment right now where there is significantly higher inflation than what we've seen before, depending on how, I don't want to discredit the CPI, but depending on how accurate the CPI is and how indicative it is for specific groups of people, it's a homogenous number. But what do you think? Like, who is to blame for the current level of inflation that we have right now?
Oh, mostly central banks. In New Zealand, the Reserve Bank's case, I mean, they're explicitly charged with keeping inflation in a 1% to 3% range. They're expected not to respond too much to surges in, say, petrol prices or food prices. Those are sort of one-offs. They come at you suddenly. There's nothing monetary policy can do about it. And so economists tend to look at concepts like core inflation. Sometimes that's just taking out those very volatile things like energy and food prices. The Reserve Bank here has a rather more sophisticated statistical model called the sectoral factor model. That suggests inflation is probably, in an underlying sense, running at about 4% at the moment. That's lower than the headline, of course, the 6.9, but it's still far too high. And they themselves acknowledge that. I mean, they were caught by surprise. They reacted aggressively in 2020, as was appropriate, because we all thought that the economy was going to slow very dramatically. I'm not critical of them for that. The big criticism I think we can make of central banks here and abroad is that they were much too slow last year to change direction. You know, it wasn't really until a couple of months ago that our Reserve Bank really started to get religion, to start to aggressively raise interest rates to get back on top of inflation. And we're seeing in the US that they've been a little further behind the game. The Fed's big tightening earlier this week really was a marker of how far away they'd let things get from them, how out of control inflation had become for the time being, at least.
Do you think, though, that like what happened with the Fed, 0.75% hike in the Fed funds rate, like, do you think that that kind of mirrors over a real similar pattern to what we saw in New Zealand with the hiking of the OCR, where it almost felt like it was too little too late? Now we have to do too much too late. Is that kind of like the same mistake just being repeated in a different jurisdiction?
Yeah. I mean, I think they're now rushing to catch up, as our central bank is. And had they been willing to raise more aggressively this time last year, or raise it all this time last year, then the OCR here, the Fed funds rate in the US, may not have needed to go so high, because neither inflation nor expectations about future inflation would themselves have run as strongly. in a sense, we've had an overheated economy both here and in the US. An unemployment rate at the moment in New Zealand of 3.2% is unsustainable. That's the Reserve Bank's own language. The Federal Reserve has said much the same about the unemployment rate in the US. That overheating will need to be compensated for by a period of economic weakness. And that's why I'm just one of many people who are saying it's not just possible that we're going to get a recession, it's almost necessary. You've got to squeeze that inflation back out of the system again.
Okay. And that's kind of something that we were having a chat about before, is this concept that a recession is inevitable and it's almost necessary. Not like it's desirable, but it's almost necessary, much like chemotherapy is not desirable at all. But if you need to kill that cancer, you need to kill some cells, and it causes a lot of collateral damage. So is it really that simple, that black and white? And is it just an issue that we just need to get over it? We've got to go into this because it's the only way. There is no other way to deal with inflation than pretty much to bring economic activity down.
Pretty much. I mean, in theory, you can run textbook stories that say people could suddenly start believing that inflation will be back at 2% and behaving accordingly. But the only reason people would change their behavior and expectations is if they see reserve banks responding aggressively and economic conditions starting to respond. The examples I point out to people is that, in the last 30 years, we've had two periods when inflation has been reduced dramatically in New Zealand. There was the early 90s and the period after 2008. In both cases, core inflation was lowered by 2 or 3 percentage points. The way it happened was through a period of economic recession. And you're right, that's painful, that's costly, it's really tough on individuals. It's why it's really important that central banks do the best they can to stop the overheats, to stop inflation getting away on us in the first place, partly to avoid those really painful but regrettably necessary costs.
Okay. It looks like it was the early 90s where inflation, or CPI, was significantly, it was as high as kind of in the neighborhood of where we're at right now. Talk to me a little bit about the environment that we saw in the early 90s versus the environment that we're in right now, specifically around the policies that were being used at the time, and employment in particular, versus today.
And it was quite different in a sense. The early 90s was the legacy when we liberalised the New Zealand economy in 84, 85. Inflation went up to 15%. And then we were on a sort of long haul path of 5 or 6 years of trying to bring inflation back down again. Interest rates were very high. We had the 90-day bill rate, from memory, at about 14% for several years. In 1991, the economy did go into recession. It was a combination of, there was an oil shock around the first Iraq War. There were national came to power at the time. They cut welfare benefits. There was a big fiscal tightening, and we held the line on interest rates. Oh, and there was a recession in Australia and the US as well. So a whole bunch of things came together. The unemployment rate rose. It had been about 4% at the start of that process. I think it was about 7% by the end of 1990. It went up to a peak of just over 11%. Now we're not looking, I think, at anything like that now. Our starting point is the unemployment rate at the moment is 3.2%. Most economists think a sort of normal, sustainable level might be between 4 and 4.5%. If we take the second episode in that recent history around 08, 09, the unemployment rate then rose from about 3.5 to about 7. Something in that 6 to 7% range for a year or two. It could well be what's required to bring inflation back down right now.
How accurate is things like the unemployment data that's coming in light of the world that we're in, where we have a huge amount of baby boomers checking out of the workforce? We've got a lot of the population kind of doing this semi sort of work from home thing, reduced hours, contractors. Surely that creates a lot of distortions in the data that people use to determine whether or not the unemployment rate is at certain levels. Do you feel like we're still capturing the accurate picture of the economy here?
There's always margins of error. The GDP numbers, for example, that came out yesterday, they'll probably be revised several times in the next 2 or 3 years. Unemployment, I'm less troubled by. I mean, it's a household survey. They ring up people. You have to participate. It measures if you were working at least 1 hour in the previous week, unemployed, whether you're actively and aggressively looking for work now. It's had a pretty reasonable track record. But more to the point, it also lines up with what firms are telling business surveys. RBNZ, for example, run a monthly survey of small and medium businesses. Those firms are saying it's just incredibly difficult to get staff at the moment. That's what you'd expect to see if the labour market's really tight. It's what the unemployment numbers are saying. It's also what the inflation numbers are saying. We've seen really rapid growth in things like construction prices. Construction's a very labour-intensive sort of industry. So, when you're an economist, you're never wise to fixate on one single number. You're trying to look across the range of data. At the moment, the story holds together. We've got some of those international shocks that there's nothing much we can do about, but we've also got a clearly overheated domestic economy, and that's reflected in inflation, it's reflected in unemployment, it's reflected in those business surveys, it's reflected in really a whole bunch of things.
And thinking about like another indicator, the CPI, Consumer Price Index, which is used again to measure the changing purchasing power of our dollars effectively. How reliable is that when certain items are excluded and things change over time in terms of how the basket of goods gets measured? Because even just a small distortion there can create a magnified result later on. That's kind of my thinking. So do you think that CPI, the way that it's measured, is sufficient enough in the world that we're in today?
There's always been a bias in the CPI because consumption patterns change over time. The usual best estimate is that bias is probably no more than about 0.5% per annum. So that's one of the reasons why we don't centre the inflation target on 0. We centre it on a small positive number. Again, it's an approximation, it's an indicator, but it's consistent in a sense with a whole bunch of other indicators that tell that prices have been rising. That's people's lived experiences. When they again respond to surveys, have you found the cost of living rising? Many more people are now saying yes than were saying that 18 months or 2 years ago. So we can only work with the data we've got. Our data is less good than it should be in the sense that we have only quarterly data on a number of these things, while most developed countries have monthly data. But the quarterly data we do have is not bad by international standards.
So far, I haven't got you to say anything too controversial, too spicy here, Michael. So you're doing well. You're doing well. I'm going to try harder, though. So we're talking about the fiscal and the monetary hands that keep on slapping us around in New Zealand, right? That's kind of how I visualize this. And thinking about who is to blame for the inflation, well, I'm going to suggest that it's not us greedy consumers who just can't get enough of that cheap plastic rattan furniture from Bunnings. It's probably actually a little bit of supply side. Yep, definitely right now. A lot of demand side, yes, but we've got to talk about this money creation. So is money creation in New Zealand a myth?
Over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of talk about the Reserve Bank's bond buying program. They bought about 55 billion of government bonds. They pay for that by putting money in the accounts that banks hold at the Reserve Bank. And some people say that's money printing. Frankly, that's just nonsense. All that's happened with those huge transactions is that the Reserve Bank has bought one sort of government liability, a government bond, put that on their balance sheet, and issued in exchange another form of government liability, deposits that banks are just sitting on now. There's no more spending that happens as a result of that or anything. The sort of money printing you should be concerned about is what we haven't really seen in New Zealand, which is if the government was increasing its spending, going out and actually purchasing goods and services, whether it's tatty plastic furniture or whatever, that's directly adding to demand in the economy. If they're doing that by borrowing from the Reserve Bank, that's closer to true money printing, and that's what we haven't seen. The government financed its big deficits over the last 2 or 3 years by borrowing in the market. The Reserve Bank tried to run monetary policy to stimulate things. They got shot. Again, the mistake wasn't what they did in 2020. It was what they did in the last 12 or 18 months in not correcting quickly enough and not recognising what was developing in the inflation data.
So with the policies that Reserve, and because of your background, like I'm pretty stoked to be able to talk to somebody who had a background with the Reserve Bank, so I can kind of figure this out a little bit. And I know things probably change over time to some degree, in some cases not fast enough, but how much of the decision making seems to be almost like a template between reserve banks worldwide, specifically with response to the COVID piece? How not scripted, that sounds too much, but how templated was the response from central banks around the world, with like particularly with New Zealand, where they didn't necessarily think about the situation on the ground here. They just looked at what everybody else did overseas. Do you think that there's almost like too much coordination and not decentralized enough thinking?
I wouldn't suggest that anything that went on here in 2020 was done because it was done in other countries. I think probably what happened was that central banks and most economic commentators, and I put myself in this category as well, looked at the events that were taking place in March 2020 and thought the economy is going to shrink quite dramatically. Some of that will be because of supply, and there's nothing that monetary policy about that. We order people to stay at home. We don't want the economy to be strong. We want it to be weak in that environment. But some of it will be extreme uncertainty. And so we expected that people would become nervous about having a high level of debt and would sell their houses. We expected that banks would be hesitant about lending, so investment would drop away. We expected income growth to slow, wage growth to slow. And in that sense, an aggressive response to cut interest rates and perhaps to use some of the unconventional tools made sense against that backdrop. The problem is that what became clear within 2 or 3 months is that not much of that was actually coming to pass. So in New Zealand, for example, we did see house prices fall for a couple of months there, and I think it was March and April 2020, but then they rebounded again quickly. We haven't seen the uncertainty around investment and the sustained reluctance to lend that most economists expected. And so again, I think what central banks did wasn't coordinated at all, but it was a sort of a common view, a common way of looking at the world. And that had partly developed out of the 2008-09 recession, when central banks, including ours, had cut interest rates very aggressively. And even so, it had taken several years for economies to get back towards full employment. There is something in the fact that, like generals always fight the last wars, central bankers and the rest of us are always shaped by the last big experience that we went through. And I think that was very much what was going on in 2020 through into 2021. In 2021, central banks saw inflation picking up, but their mindset, I think, was very shaped by that experience the last decade that said, look, we've jumped at shadows once too often. Here in New Zealand, the Reserve Bank tightened in both 2010 and 2014. In both cases, it proved to be a mistake, and they had to quickly reverse themselves. The ECB had made similar mistakes. The Fed had come close to tightening unnecessarily in the middle of the last decade as well. And so that mindset, that background, I think, was a lot of what was going on.
Because, and you said it yourself, you believe it was appropriate, that response right at that time. I'm still a little bit skeptical, I guess you could say. But I guess thinking 2 to 3 months later, and this kind of ties into what you were just saying around just how things evolved. But 2 or 3 months later, it was kind of clear that things weren't as bad as what they were. Yet for almost like 2 years, they kept the settings as they were, 18 months. So why do you think I know they didn't want to be paranoid that they were jumping at shadows again, like you say, but why did they kind of keep the settings as they were, where interest rates were low and they still kind of persisted with the LSAT program and all that sort of thing? Why did they keep on doing that for so long when clearly it wasn't required?
Yeah, I mean, the LSAT one is one I don't really understand. I sort of understand why they did it in March 2020. They did it because at the time they wanted to be able to take interest rates negative. Banks weren't ready. But by the end of 2020, they tell us banks were ready. So there's no excuse for having continued to run the LSAT in last year. Not only was it unnecessary, it's proved hugely expensive. The losses on the portfolio are now up to almost $8.5 billion, a staggering waste of taxpayers' money. Again, the instruments are adopted because they have a view of where the economy is going. So if you look at their economic forecasts back in, I think it was November 2020, their monetary policy statement then, they reckoned at the time that inflation now would still be only about 1%. And so their policy was consistent with the forecasts. The problem was they had a mistaken view of how the economy was going to unfold. And I think, again, that reflected the last 10 years of repeated surprises in which inflation here and in other countries had undershot had consistently undershot. It took a long time for them to adjust to that. I was looking at some documents from a Reserve Bank board meeting that was held in it was August last year, and they've been released under the Official Information Act. They're on the Reserve Bank website. And August, September last year, the Reserve Bank chief economist is telling the board, oh, we're pretty sure it's all transitory. And, we've got plenty of time. We can wait for a year's data. And I think that experience the last 10 years where interest rates weren't changed much, where inflation continually undershot, lulled them into a sense that even if core inflation did pick up, it wasn't going to pick up to an extent that would quickly become problematic. I mean, my criticism there is not only of them, it's of private sector forecasters as well. If you look at private sector forecasts on the whole in late 2020 and early 2021, they weren't that much different from the Reserve Banks. So the entire macroeconomic sort of forecasting and commentary community has really been taken by surprise. Where we start to differ is that 6 months ago, I was arguing the Reserve Bank should have been raising 75 or 100 points at a go to get ahead of things. It took them another 5 or 6 months to really recognise the scale of the problem that they had. But, they weren't that unusual. Their mistake has been much the same mistake that their peers overseas have made. In some cases, they've done worse. The Reserve Bank of Australia still looks like it's quite behind the game relative even to the Reserve Bank of New Zealand.
But is it appropriate that our reference point is the other central banks around the world? Is that inappropriate for the Reserve Bank to looking at that and kind of using that as the benchmark rather than looking at what is right here on the ground?
No, it's not. But I think when you're holding them to account, so, one of the issues that the government faces over the next 6 or 8 months is, do they reappoint Adrian Orr? Personally, I don't think he should be reappointed. I think he will be reappointed. But, if you're evaluating his performance and you said he'd done worse than all other central banks, there will be a stronger case for criticising him. If he's made the same mistake as a bunch of his peers, you still want to hold them all to account, but you can't single them out to quite the same extent. If he's made the same mistake as private sector commentators, then again, you want to be a little bit cautious about saying, were the decisions that were made, even though they look wrong with hindsight, the best that realistically could have been made with the information they had at the time? So had the Reserve Bank, say in February last year, said, look, inflation's going to be a real problem, we're going to raise interest rates by 75 basis points and get them back to where they were before COVID, there would have been a massive uproar, both politically and I think in the business community. They would have been right. But I mean, there is that, as both in markets and in life, of you can be right, but too early. So my point really is that if you're sort of holding someone to account in the real world and thinking about whether you dismiss someone or not reappoint them, and there should be a high threshold for doing that, you've got to have quite a careful, nuanced assessment of the decisions they're making with the information realistically had available at the time. Now, we expect the Reserve Bank to do very well because they have by far the biggest team of macroeconomists in this country. They should be able to be generating consistent research and analysis that's stimulating thinking internally and externally. And that's been another gap under Adrian Orr. There's hardly been any published research over the last 2 years. So another black mark. It's one of the reasons why I don't think he should be reappointed. But you have to look at the big picture, if you like, rather than simply looking at a bottom line inflation number.
Okay. Going back to LSAP, so large-scale asset purchases, something that I kind of understand a tiny little bit about, and I don't want to sort of get sidetracked and go do a deep dive in that, but you did mention this $8.5 billion loss that now the taxpayers are left with. And in the spirit of accountability, because these are unelected people that have effectively caused an $8.5 billion loss on New Zealanders. Can you unpack that a little bit? What does that mean?
Essentially, what was happening was back when interest rates were very, very low in March, April 2020, the Reserve Bank was buying government bonds from the market. And the way in which interest rates and bond prices work, when interest rates are low, bond prices are high. So they were buying an asset right at the top of the market. Their argument was that by doing so, they could bring down long-term interest rates and help stimulate the economy. The problem is that New Zealand is not the United States. If you're in the United States, 30-year mortgage rates matter enormously because that's where most people borrow, they get their mortgage at. In New Zealand, most people who take a mortgage, most business finance is pretty short term. It's either floating rate pegged to the bank bill rate or fixed for maybe 1 or 2 years. Long-term bond rates just don't matter that much. But having bought those bonds at the top of the market, Then as the economy recovered, we've seen bond yields rising really, really sharply. Bond prices have collapsed. The bank is about to start selling some of those bonds back to the Treasury in the market in the next month or two. They look like they're probably close to doing that at the bottom. So when interest rates were near a record low, instead of locking in long-term debt at those record low interest rates, which would have been the sensible debt management policy, they said, no, we'll take the long-term bonds out of the market, and in exchange, we'll pay for them with deposits that banks hold at the Reserve Bank. Those deposits bear the OCR. So while the OCR is really low, they're really cheap. But now as the OCR is 2, perhaps heading for 4%, the cost of that different form of debt is staggeringly high. And that $8.5 billion is just the sort of the best guess of the loss. It's the mark-to-market value of the position that's sitting on the bank's books. Now, I would say you made the point about unelected bureaucrats, and that's right, the Reserve Bank people aren't. But in this case, the decision to take these positions on did have the approval of the Minister of Finance. He gave them a specific indemnity, and it's probable that if he'd not done so, they would not have been purchasing on anything like the scale that they were, because the Reserve Bank balance sheet, they just don't have enough capital to absorb sorts of losses.
And I don't know him from a bar of soap, Grant Robertson, so I have no idea what his level of knowledge is with respect to how that works. But the way that you just explained that actually was really, really well. Effectively, they bought at the top, they're selling at the bottom, big loss, we have to pay for it. Do you think that Grant Robertson actually understands that? Do you think he understood that when he gave them that approval?
As best as I can see, there was no proper risk analysis done at the time. If there was such a document, they had every incentive to publish. I think the minister was persuaded by the bank and the Treasury that they needed to sort of do everything. And I think in Robertson's defence, he's not the technical expert. You'd expect him to take advice from the Treasury and the bank. Some responsibility, I think, here rests with the Secretary of the Treasury. The Treasury are the professional advisors who are supposed to be saying, hey, what's the risk here? What could go wrong? How much money could we lose? The Treasury told the Minister of Finance that this was an okay strategy to be adopting. It was a significant failure on both their part, just because it was always an instrument that wasn't well designed for New Zealand circumstances, where long-term bond rates don't matter much to anyone other than the government itself.
So that's really awesome. Thank you, Mike. Thank you for explaining that so clearly. I want to now kind of just pick your brain on something else, and forgive me if these questions don't really sound kind of like I'm coming from a very highly educated point of view, but the more I look into this, the more I realize that even those that kind of understand how things work, they don't really understand how things work either. And that's why I don't care anymore if I sound like an idiot by asking these questions. I remember that when I was going to university, I was kind of taught that, hey, this is how banking works. The banks take money from savers, they give it to lenders, and they take a cut in between. They're an intermediary. And then I kind of discovered, well, how fractional reserve banking worked to a certain degree. I kind of understand that. And then there's this new kind of concept that I've been grappling with over the last few years called the credit creation theory of banking. Can you, to the best of your ability, kind of just describe to me the different ways, different paradigms that we can look at how banking works in New Zealand? And I'm talking about from the everyday investor's perspective, not necessarily from a central bank's perspective. So we're talking about private money, how money comes into existence in the New Zealand economy. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, by and large, what we call money, deposits at banks, comes into existence through a process of credit creation. If I buy your house, I go to the bank, I take a mortgage. Simultaneously, with that mortgage, I pay you for the house. That money is now sitting in your account as a deposit. The balance sheet of banks is a little bit bigger as a result by my credit and your deposit. And the fact that I'm willing to take that credit, that you're willing to hold that deposit, and the bank is willing to lend to me is really the essence of the process. Now, some people will look at that and say, so everything's out of control, everything's determined by banks. And that's simply not true, because what determines my willingness to buy? What determines my willingness, how much I'll pay for a house? Well, the interest rate makes quite a big difference there. And who sets the interest rate? The Reserve Bank does. So the Reserve Bank's not in the business of trying to control the money supply, any particular measure of it. What it's trying to do is to control the overall level of demand and activity in the economy. If house prices are rising strongly, then it's likely that there will be more credit in the economy and more deposits. The two are two sides of the same coin. The arguments about money, I mean, they're often quite sterile. In fact, those of us who studied economics back in the sixth form or something of the sort like that decades ago, probably had a sort of fractional reserve banking view of things, that sort of somebody walks into a bank with a deposit, puts the money in the bank, and then the bank lends that out later. It's a nice stylization, and it's quite good for teaching young people how processes work. It's also, to some extent, the way in which an individual bank works, because an individual bank has to be confident that if it lends, that it can attract the deposits back. Because go back to my example, I buy your house, I might bank with the ANZ, but you might bank with Westpac. So if the ANZ lends me $1 million and I pay that to you, ANZ's now lost that $1 million, and Westpac, your bank, has picked it up. ANZ's got to be confident that it can continue to attract those deposits. So there's a bit of a difference there between the way in which these things work from an individual bank perspective and the way in which they work at the system as a whole. From an individual customer and individual bank perspective, flows on your balance sheet, the ability to retain deposits really, really matters a lot. At the banking system level, it's a closed system. Every loan either repays another loan or creates another deposit within the system.
That's great. So I want to hone in on that phrase, closed system, because that's where I kind of get a little bit unstuck. To be honest, I kind of struggle with that concept a little bit, because for me, it's really hard to imagine where those dollars were before the bank created them. Like, where did they come from, right? And maybe one of the ways that we could tackle this is just talk about two scenarios, and we'll use that house purchasing thing maybe as a good idea. One where somebody buys a new home 10 years in the future, so they're borrowing a lot more than what was originally borrowed to buy that home, let's say. So someone's borrowing money from the bank with ANZ to buy a property, and they're buying it off someone who banked with Westpac. Is it really a closed system if there's more credit creation that happens in 10 years' time than what was destroyed in terms of credit when the debt was repaid? If that makes sense to you. I'm not quite sure if I'm expressing myself clearly here, but I just want to know if there is kind of like a built-in inflationary aspect to this, where as more activity happens, there's almost like a pyramid scheme of credit creation.
I guess what I meant by closed system just was that the money's not going anywhere. It's even like, again, go back to when I was learning economics. Countries had fixed exchange rates typically. And so if there was money creation going on in New Zealand, a bank lends and I give you the money, you might then take that money and spend it on imports. That would reduce the New Zealand money supply. For the last 40 years, we've had a floating exchange rate system. If you want to use your money to buy imports, you have to find someone to sell you that money. So for every seller of the New Zealand dollar, there's a buyer of the New Zealand dollar. Deposit levels in New Zealand are not affected by anything outside the system. And the level of economic activity, the overall level of credit, can be influenced by the choices that the Reserve Bank in particular is making, to some extent about capital requirements, but mostly in the sort of year-to-year fluctuations, the choices they're making about interest rates. Reserve Bank doesn't attempt to control house prices, and nor should they, but house price cycles tend to be quite correlated with other cycles in economic activity. So when employment's strong, house prices are often bid up. When the economy is weak, say in 08, 09, house prices were falling. And probably, as we were saying earlier, we're going into a recession in New Zealand over the next year or two. House prices are already falling here.
Yeah, to me, it feels like this gigantic big ball of string. It's all kind of all connected, and I know things are correlated. Sometimes they're causal, but it's definitely not a simple black and white. Do this, this happens, and if this happens, that happens. It's very, very interconnected, isn't it?
That's right. And when I joined the Reserve Bank first, almost 40 years ago, that was the age of monetarism, and there was still a view among some people at the Reserve Bank that once the thing was freed up, we should set targets for the money supply. But, we did the analysis then, and we quickly realised that it didn't make a lot of sense. These days, the central bank pays almost no attention to money supply measures. What it focuses on, and rightly so in my view, is the overall level of demand and activity. And it says, well, look, the level of credit will be determined by, as you say, the complex system of things that together make up the ball of string. Some of it will be about regulatory restrictions. Some of it will be about capital requirements. Some of it will be about how the economy is doing. Some of it will be about how interest rates are doing.
Okay. So again, I'm going to keep on pushing on this one, just to make sure I fully get this. So somebody comes along and they want to buy a property for $1 million. They borrow $800,000 from ANZ. They buy it off of somebody else. That somebody else gets $1 million. $200,000 came from the other purchaser. $800,000 was created from the bank, and then that formed the $1 million to buy that property. That person who received that $1 million to sell the property, they're just going to be living in a caravan. They didn't repay any mortgage as a result. Effectively, there's about another $1 million or so that's floating around in the economy that didn't exist before. Am I seeing this correct? And is that possible, if that's true, that if enough of that happens, then there's more money supply and therefore potentially more inflation? Is that the correct way to look at it?
I think there's bits of that are right and bits that are wrong.
Okay.
In terms of money supply measures, that's true, because money supply measures are just the total amount of deposits essentially held in our banking system. So that chain of transactions that you describe, there's now more debt outstanding and there's more deposits outstanding. The money supply is higher. But I mean, this is one of the reasons why the money supply is not in isolation a particularly helpful variable. You think about the person who sold the house and is now living in the caravan. They've got $1 million that they can spend on their retirement or whatever the rest of their lives. But on the other hand, me, who's taken out the $800,000 loan, has now got that debt that I'm having to repay over the next 30 years. In a sense, my debt more or less offsets your asset to spend. That's why it's the overall demand conditions in the economy that really matter. Overall resources, unemployment, output gaps, as we say in the jargon, not money supply measures per se. Money supply measures are just not particularly correlated with anything, including inflation. So we've seen, for example, in New Zealand that through that process of house prices being bid up by the artificial scarcity in land that things like the RMA have created over 40 years, both debt and money supply measures have increased enormously as a share of GDP. So they've increased much faster than inflation has. So that sort of mechanical relationship that you might think of in sort of, an extreme hyperinflation just doesn't hold in reasonably stable functioning markets like New Zealand. And I mean, one of the ways to see that, I guess, is that the last 10 years was a period where general inflation here and in a bunch of other countries consistently undershot inflation targets. And that was even though in New Zealand we saw a big growth in house prices and a big increase, therefore, in both deposits at the banking system and loans made by the banks.
Okay. That's a really, really good explanation. Thanks for that. And really, really clearly outlining that. So going back to that ball of string idea where everything is kind of somewhat interconnected, both directly and indirectly, just to finish up on central bank issued digital currencies, it's something that I'm quite fascinated about, and I'm keen to do a bit of a deep dive on that shortly. But from your perspective, would central bank issued digital currencies give the Reserve Bank more accurate tools at their disposal to control how we spend money and therefore by extension reduce some of the ups and downs and inflation and deflation, all that sort of stuff? Would it be a more effective tool? Should we look forward to central bank issued digital currencies with optimism?
A lot depends. One would be used. I think in a realistic world in the next 5 or 10 years, no. I think central bank digital currencies are a bit of a dead end. They probably won't do much harm, but they won't change very much either. In principle, if a digital currency issued by a central bank replaced physical banknotes and coins, they might wouldn't enable reserve banks to more easily take interest rates negative if the economy required that. The big issue at the moment is that if the Reserve Bank takes interest rates to -5%, everyone sensibly will look at their bank deposit and say, I'm not going to put up with -5% interest rates. I'll just convert my deposits into banknotes and hold them in a safe somewhere. It's a rather arbitrary obstacle, and moving to digital central bank currency would eliminate that. But I don't see any central bank anywhere at the moment who's looking to really make that transition. I mean, our own Reserve Bank has been quite clear that in their exploration digital currencies, they're looking to safeguard a role for physical currency. So it sees the two operating hand in hand. My biggest issue is that I actually don't think that there would be much demand in New Zealand for a central bank digital currency. And I've got a couple of reasons that sort of illustrate that point. One is, frankly, most of us happily hold our money in bank deposits, and we always have done. It's been decades since most people were being paid in physical cash. Most people happily operate with commercial bank liabilities, and it's convenient for them to do so because it's a sort of bundled product. You've got deposits with the same organisation that you might have your mortgage with. They might sell you insurance. They offer you payment services. A central bank doesn't have any of those commercial incentives to be able to have really attractive products. Now, it's true that if there's a banking crisis, you would expect people to run to the central bank product. People at the moment, if they think banks are failing, might run to physical currency. They might run to a digital currency instead. But, we've got a really safe, well-managed banking system. It's been a very long time since we've had systemic financial crisis in New Zealand. The bank could launch the product tomorrow, and I think they would find it was a bit of a white elephant. There just wouldn't be much take up on it.
So you kind of see that the role for a CBDC really will probably only exist if there was a significant, sustained structural financial crisis of some sort that caused consumers to demand it, rather than an agenda to push it as an alternative to increase the authority of the central bank. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I really don't see how it does. It increases the authority of the central bank unless you try and, at the extreme, ban banks from the credit creation, money creation process. And I don't see any appetite for that among central banks around the world. I mean, one of my criticisms of the Reserve Bank here's consultative document on central bank digital currency last year was that it seemed like sort of an idea in pursuit of a justification. It was the sort of thing that was around internationally. They thought they should do some work on it, but it wasn't clear why you would actually want to introduce one. Banks offer, technologically sophisticated, relatively low risk products that meet our payment systems, our store of value demands, that whole range of things that we want to do. At the margin, there are a few possibilities. A central bank digital currency could, in principle, be used to make foreign exchange transactions easier and cheap. But, for most of us, that's a pretty marginal thing, realistically. So, yeah, I mean, I'm just skeptical that there's much there, and I'll be a little bit surprised if our central bank pushes ahead with issuing one.
Yeah, that's right. Well, it kind of reeks of the whole LSAP thing, right? Like, do we really need this? But it's a
indeed.
Yeah.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, this has been phenomenal. Thank you so much, Michael, for your time today. I really, really appreciate that. And for me, I've learned a lot, and I know that our listeners have. I was possibly like, I'm always a little bit worried. The smarter my guests are, I kind of worry that they might come across too technical and they might lose some people. But I genuinely believe that the way you explained that was totally spot on. So I want to plug something that you're involved in, Croaking Cassandra. First up, where does the name come from? It might be obvious to some, but why Croaking Cassandra?
It comes from John Maynard Keynes, the famous British economist from 100 years ago, who published a volume of what he called Essays in Persuasion. And he wrote in the foreword that they were the croakings of a Cassandra, doomed to be never believed. Cassandra in Greek mythology was both right and never believed. So it's a slightly arrogant tone to it, perhaps. It was a bit of my experience my last few years at the Reserve Bank that I thought that I wasn't actually getting anywhere. So I was looking around for an imaginative title, and I thought, well, here we go. I'll put my views out there. They may still not be taken seriously, but at least I'll put things on the record.
Hey, join the club. That's all good, man. That's great. So this like a lot of the articles on there, really, really well written. It's not difficult to understand. Some of it might be, but like the more that I've been reading it, the more I'm starting to pick it up and I'm starting to understand it. And I think that everyday investors cannot do this passively on autopilot any longer. We need to be educated. So this is a really great resource. And I'd urge everybody to head on over to croakandcassandra.com, sign up to the newsletter if you can. Again, thank you very much, Michael, for your time, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Good. Thanks, Darcy. I enjoyed it. So
awesome. Take care.
good.